Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. This week, I'm joined by Adam Rittenberg from ESPN. We'll get into some traditional off-season talk with signs pointing toward a more traditional off-season. In fact, how about this? Coastal Carolina, everybody's favorite underdog from last season, the Chanticleers are currently about halfway through spring practice. Adam and I will discuss this past coaching hiring cycle. We haven't had a chance to really dig into some of the trends, what hires that we thought were interesting and why. As of this recording, that cycle is not yet over. Tuesday, February 9th, UCF has just hired an AD and will begin its coaching search to replace Josh Heupel, who left for Tennessee. There has also been some interesting transfer movement. In fact, February is becoming transfer month in college football. Right before we started recording, there was also some interesting and notable future scheduling news, and we'll get into that as well. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a good review and a good rating. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is my friend Adam Rittenberg from ESPN, enjoying or trying to enjoy a little bit of an off season. There's never truly an off season, Adam, but thanks for making a little time as we track a coaching cycle, a coaching search cycle, carousel that never really ends. But thanks for joining me, Adam.
Yeah, you bet, Ralph. Always good to be with you. And you're right, it doesn't end. And yeah, I don't know about you. I'm not a big off-season guy in general, but after this season, I was looking forward to just kind of getting beyond 2020 and hopefully towards a more normal 2021. And so, certainly coaching searches are a little sign of that normalcy. So that's good. Yeah,
if nothing else, like the workflow has seemingly, hopefully, will move into a more normal level heading into 2021. But one of the reasons why I brought you on is to talk some coach stuff, some coaching search carousel stuff, because as much as we talk about that a lot on this show, I never kind of went back and did a big picture review of how this went. There was probably a little more activity than we thought. The general consensus was it was going to be kind of a dead cycle because a lot of teams and a lot of schools thought that it might be better to save a little money, not necessarily spend huge money on buyouts during a pandemic when you're cutting costs in a lot of places. But as always, the SEC and a few other schools come through because even during a pandemic, even during a financial crisis, they'll always find some pennies in the couch cushions to buy out a coach. So I guess I'll start very big picture here and sort of like your overall takeaways from the cycle. What in particular maybe stood out on an individual hire basis or just more on a theme basis?
Right. Yeah. To your point, Ralph, I mean, it was a more robust cycle than I think any of us thought. I've been told, I'm sure you're talking to some of the same people throughout the fall, people aren't going to spend if a school is on the fence of keeping a coach or letting him go. They're going to lean towards keeping him because of all the other financial issues that are going on. And, it just, again, in the back of my mind, I'm like, this is college football. They're going to make moves. This is the most emotional, crazy, ridiculously spending, poor contract creating sport out there, and they're going to eat money, and that's exactly what happened. I still remember getting a tip right before the Texas news came out about Tom Herman getting fired, and was trying to confirm it. And I'd heard earlier that week that it was still on the table, and they were about to play their bowl game against Colorado, I believe, or maybe they just already played their bowl game. And it was like, wow, this could still happen. And then boom, it happens. And you think about Auburn and Texas. Tennessee's a little unique, and we can certainly talk about that. But South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Illinois. I mean, none of those schools were a sure thing entering the year, especially in a pandemic. And you look at Texas and Auburn, you had coaches with winning records, playing essentially conference-only schedule. I know Texas had, I think, one out-of-conference game in the Big 12, and had a lot of money left, and hadn't been failures, but those schools felt like they needed to make changes, and they went ahead and did that. And so I think it just shows I don't know if power is the right word. Maybe there's a better word for the fact that the coaching carousel is going to move. You can put a pandemic, you can put all sorts of, crazy financial restrictions in play. This thing is going to move every single year, and it certainly did this year.
Yeah, it was still, I guess, in some ways a little quieter. I mean, there were probably some places maybe at the group of 5 level that might have been a little more aggressive. And I think what also made it quieter was a lot of the moves we saw coaches hired that were not necessarily, that weren't sitting head coaches. Auburn made a move for a sitting head coach, but in a lot of other places, a place like Texas opens up and it doesn't create a lot of trickle down. A place like South Carolina opens up and it doesn't knock over multiple dominoes because of those coaches who got hired.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and we haven't seen that many Power 5 to Power 5 moves made even recently in a normal year, but there weren't. Yeah, that just wasn't there. You had again, South Carolina hiring a non-coordinator. You had Arizona hiring a NFL position coach who'd been a college coordinator and bounced around a ton in Jed Fish. Illinois hired a former Big Ten head coach, but it was in the NFL, and Brett Bielema. So you're right. There wasn't that huge domino effect. Now we'll see what UCF does, and maybe there's still something that's out there. But even Tennessee going with a Josh Heupel instead of maybe a Power 5 head coach, didn't create much of a reaction. And so it wasn't. I don't think anyone's going to remember this hiring cycle, Ralph, as big splash year, because it just wasn't. There weren't too many names that just jump out off the page like, wow, that's going to set Program X on the course for a bunch of championships. Not to say that there won't be successful coaches, but it was underwhelming, I would say, as a whole, just the overall coaches that were hired in this year, even though we had some big jobs that were surprisingly open. Yeah,
I haven't done the numbers in a couple of years. I was keeping a little better track, and I probably need to go back and redo them. But there is one of the things I've tried to sort of enforce to my Twitter followers and people who read my stuff and when listen to these podcasts is the Power 5 to Power 5 move is becoming. It didn't happen, I think, at all this year. We just ran through it, but it is becoming increasingly rare. In college football in general. The money at most Power 5 schools is pretty good. I think coaches look at the uncertainty of movement and are sort of, shy away from that. In other words, I'll go with the devil I know, right? I have a comfortable situation here. I get paid well, unless it's a clear jump forward. I think of somebody like Matt Campbell, who is, now just re-upped at Iowa State for another 8-year contract, where he clearly doesn't want to jump to just anything. And I think that's the way it is now in college football. I think that there are a handful of jobs that distinguish themselves as true blue blood jobs, at Ohio State or in Alabama or places like that. But generally speaking, I think when you have a coach who's successful in a comfortable situation, the type of coach who would be targeted at a place like, let's say, in Auburn or when a Texas opens up, it's becoming harder and harder to get those coaches out of those places.
Right. And, I think most of the programs you mentioned, did swing for Power 5 coaches. Tennessee certainly did. Auburn did. and they weren't able to land them. Not to say that they weren't, again, happy with who they ended up getting, but it is rare. I mean, I think of Dan Mullen going from Mississippi State to Florida. But again, Florida was interested in Scott Frost and Chip Kelly and ended up with Dan Mullen. So it really does not happen that often. It's a great point, and something that is worth kind of looking at more closely. You just look at a lot of the coaches that are at the top programs right now. Dabo Swinney was an internal promotion. Ryan Day was an internal promotion. Lincoln Riley was an internal promotion. Tom Herman, before he got fired, had come from Houston. Nick Saban came from the NFL. Clay Helton was an internal promotion. So the real prime jobs, Mario Cristobal at Oregon, when was the last time, other than maybe Florida, that a prime top college football, at Orgeron, internal promotion, a top college football job went out and landed another Power 5 coach to come there? Even though these are some of the top jobs, these are the top jobs that we're talking about. Texas with Steve Sarkisian, obviously a former Power 5 head coach at USC and Washington, but was an assistant when he got the Texas job. So it is increasingly rare around the sport, even at the very top upper crust type jobs.
I think part of it becomes at the very top line jobs, and we saw it with Ryan Day and Lincoln Riley are perfect examples of that. Is I have seen this coach work in my system. Now, with Lincoln, it was for a couple of years. With Ryan Day, I think he had only been on staff a year or two. But in some ways, those coaches have an advantage by being in the system, so to speak, by being at Oklahoma and being at Ohio State. The ADs, the people in charge, can watch them work. They come in with good pedigrees. They were brought in and sort of signed off on by their predecessors, and it eliminates some of the uncertainty you get. Even if you hire a successful coach at another program, you still haven't seen that coach work. You still haven't built up a relationship. So I think that model for a lot of the top programs, I think, is going to become the model. Like, see if I can identify someone from within to keep a good thing going, as opposed to dealing with the uncertainty of reaching into another program and seeing if he fits what I want.
Yeah, it's a great point. And even in that one example with Florida, you have an athletic director in Scott Strickland who had Dan Mullen at Mississippi State.
Exactly.
So there was familiarity there in the end. But you're right. I think we're going to see more and more of that. Although, you know what? I mean, USC comes open this year. I don't think they're promoting anybody.
That's true.
I think if Notre Dame comes open, that could be Matt Campbell, that where he goes. Or if Penn State, if James Franklin were to leave, I think that could be Matt Campbell. But I do think that if you can create continuity, there's certainly value there. As you were talking, I was thinking about the situation at Wisconsin, which got some great news late last week with Jim Leonhard, their defensive coordinator, who had a chance to become the Green Bay Packers defensive coordinator, ends up staying at Wisconsin in this role. And it's set up, I think we'd all agree. I mean, we never know what happens in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, however long Paul Chryst is there. But it is absolutely set up for Wisconsin, which has been one of the most consistent programs in all of college football, to have this internal succession plan with whenever Paul Chryst moves on, Jim Leonhard is going to be the guy. I don't think there's much of a question about that unless he were to leave from now until whenever Paul steps aside. So I think that's always the best situation if you can create it, but and you're having success and you have a chance to sort of continue that with someone that you've seen work and develop and understands what it takes to win at your particular program.
The other thing that didn't happen in this cycle, or did not happen much, was minority hires. Now, Andy Avalos got the job at Boise State, former Boise State assistant coach, moved on from Oregon State. He was Oregon, where he was defensive coordinator there. And Charles Huff is now the head coach at Marshall, which I thought was a pretty interesting hire. Now, it was interesting also that they got rid of Doc Holliday after a pretty long and successful tenure there. But unfortunately for some of these coaches, long and successful, sometimes the long becomes more of a problem than the record. I think that there are programs where they simply get tired of seeing the same guy there, and they feel like they have a little bit of a ceiling, so they just want to change coaches for the sake of changing coaches because it maybe gooses the fan base a little bit. And Huff coming over after a successful 10 years at Penn State and Alabama was an interesting hire. But generally speaking, this is still a business where a lot of the coaches, and even the coaches where you don't see a lot of a track record, or maybe you're just getting into the retread zone, like in some of the smaller jobs. If you're going to hire Shane Beamer, who has no real, and listen, Shane Beamer's a decent guy and has been part of successful teams, but it does seem like we're hiring coaches that don't necessarily have much of a track record, but they all tend to be white coaches.
No doubt. I mean, that was the most disappointing element of this hiring cycle. And I know you've written about it for many years. I've written about it for many years. I'm tired of writing about it, but we're going to keep writing about it because it's not changing. And the thing that's really frustrating, in talking to black coaches, even some that did get jobs this year, as either moving up to coordinator jobs or moving on to the NFL, they've talked about it and they're frustrated, and they spent a lot of 2020 talking about it because they had more free time and there was more opportunity to hop on to a Zoom call or some type of online seminar to discuss the shortages, especially in a year like that, Ralph. I mean, that's what really bothered me. There was so much focus on social justice and equity, and how do we have a sport that is more reflective of who's playing the game. And then you have this hiring cycle where you have 3 black Power 5 coaches fired. Now, I can't argue against any of those moves, whether it was Derek Mason, Lovie Smith, or Kevin Sumlin, but you lose 3 of the not that many Power 5 jobs occupied by minority coaches, and then you add none in the minority or in that category in terms of filling those spots. Now, we know that Tennessee made a strong push for Tony Elliott of Clemson, the offensive coordinator there, who continues to stay with Dabo Swinney and should get a very good job whenever he decides to move on. I know there was some interest in James Franklin from Penn State, but ultimately they hired a white coach. And Charles Huff, the only African-American coach hired in the 2020-21 cycle, and certainly congrats to Charles, and he deserves it. But it was discouraging, especially when you see some of the hires made. Again, nothing against Shane Beamer, but not a coordinator, offensive or defensive coordinator, son of a Hall of Fame coach. Even Terry Bowden getting the Louisiana Monroe job, son of a Hall of Fame coach. Were there black candidates involved there? I know Brian Johnson from Florida was interviewed at both South Carolina and Boise State. Didn't get those jobs. Now he's in the NFL. And there weren't very many that I knew about. I don't know if you know other minority candidates that were in the mix for Vanderbilt, for an Auburn, some of these other jobs, Texas, that were open. So that's what's discouraging, is that it seems like there's a lot of attention on this, and there are more initiatives than ever. I know Mike Loxley's group is a new one that has sprung up and created some good dialogue and opportunities for minority coaches. It's all over the place. I mean, the Rooney Rule is being discussed, to be adopted by more than just the West Coast Conference. It's, I guess, the Bill Russell Rule in the West Coast Conference, but that's been discussed at NCAA levels. Nothing's really happened there. So we talk about it, and there's a lot of initiatives to increase the numbers, but the numbers just aren't getting better. They aren't. And there's really nothing that anyone can say to make me feel optimistic that they're going to change, because they just don't change. Yeah. And so that's and that frustration, I can tell you, is very much shared by African American coaches throughout the sport. They have discussed it ad nauseum here the last year or so.
Yeah, I feel like to a certain degree it's a downstream problem in a way, and I haven't done enough reporting on it to even elaborate on it, so I don't necessarily want to get into the project I'm working on. But you do sort of wonder if don't talk to me about coordinators and things along those lines. It's almost, are enough African American players being encouraged to go into coaching? And being having careers fostered at a young age. And I do wonder if sort of when there's a systemic problem, again, sort of look downstream more than upstream. But it's also a very simple numbers game, as you said. Who is playing college football, major college football? Well, I believe the most recent numbers were about 66% of the players, of the scholarship players, are black. I may be a little off on that. It might be a couple of ticks higher or lower. So the idea that the coaching pool doesn't reflect that, and the leadership doesn't reflect a sport that is majority African American, doesn't make sense. And it did make sense, 15, 20, 30 years ago when it was clearly racism, right? When we were not that far away from the sport not being fully integrated at the player level in certain schools. I mean, if the SEC integrates in the 60s and 70s, that change is not coming so quickly 10 to 20 years later. But now we're far enough removed that you'd think that things would be along a little bit. And again, I understand, like, when you look at each specific circumstance, I don't necessarily think racism is the reason why so-and-so was hired and where another coach wasn't hired. So it becomes systemic issues, and when you see a systemic issue, maybe the place to look is not necessarily at the top, but sort of like way back toward the bottom. Like, let's go deeper into the pipeline to find the problems. I don't have the answers. Again, I'm going to hopefully, write some stuff this offseason to maybe, see if smarter people than me have some different answers. But I do wonder if we're looking at the wrong part of the pipeline. You have to look farther down the pipeline to find some of the reasons, some of the ways to fix this.
It's a really interesting part. I mean, I've focused probably like you have on the, how many coordinators are in position to get these jobs. How many?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable place to look.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, how many black offensive play callers are there in college football at the Power 5 level? There's not many. Tony Elliott's one, and he continues to stay at Clemson, which is obviously his right. Brian Johnson at Florida became one this year, but now he's off to the NFL. So maybe he comes back to college. But maybe it is at those lower levels. I also think it's also, how many coaching agents are people of color? How many search firm folks are people of color? How many university presidents or the people that are really making these decisions are people of color? Because that to me, it's just hard not to draw a correlation there, Ralph, because that's where the demographics are very different than they are in those locker rooms. Let's be honest. It's just hard to say, well, if you're not in those circles, if you're not working it. I mean, I'll use Jed Fish as an example.
I was going to go there, so please do. That's a perfect example.
So Jed is a guy, for those who don't know, the new head coach at Arizona. I actually got to know Jed for the first time when I was covering the Big Ten for ESPN when he was the offensive coordinator at Minnesota back in 2009. But he has moved a lot. I mean, NFL, college, Seahawks, University of Miami, Jaguars, University of Michigan, UCLA, the Rams, and then the Patriots before getting the Arizona job. But so he's bounced around a lot. Been a coordinator, been a position coach, has not been a head coach until now. But one thing that I know Jed was very good at was working his way into the mix for these searches. Was involved for the Rutgers search a couple. I think when Schiano got it, and maybe even the time before that. But he's been a guy that's discussed in those circles, and I don't hear as many minority assistants with the same backgrounds being discussed in those circles. Mm-hmm. So why is that? I mean, that's where I tend to focus is why are they not being discussed like Jed was, I think, for the years leading up to him finally getting this head coaching opportunity at Arizona, and how can that change? Because if you're not being talked about, and maybe some of it's our fault in the media, or it's just the search firm issue or the agent issue, why are they not getting the same type of attention and buzz that some of the white candidates are getting? Yeah,
the one thing I'll add on Fish is he had a relationship with the university president of Arizona. Right.
Yes.
Now, no need to even flesh that out, but I mean, like a personal relationship. They had known each other. It might have even been a family connection there. To which, so I mean, that sort of sums it up, right? Doesn't it? Like, I mean, and this is not to say that he won't be a good coach or that he doesn't have that he's not deserving of that job when the final decision was made, but the simple fact that like he in a way was aided by the fact that he had a personal connection to the university president. And I think that sort of sums up, just as you said, with all the other connections there, that he was a guy who constantly sort of was in the mix, despite a resume that didn't necessarily pop out as like, oh, well, here's clearly a guy who needs to be on everybody's radar. His resume looks like a lot of resumes that aren't necessarily people who are on a lot of people's radar.
Right. No doubt. And I just hope that there, and maybe a guy like that's a model for that ambitious, minority assistant who's wondering why can't I get into this mix? I mean, that is a path that you could take. But I just think about the hires this time around. I mean, Andy Avalos certainly I thought was a great hire, but again, very familiar to the Boise State people. It wasn't like they had to go searching to figure out who he was. The Charles Huff one is really interesting because you don't see very many running backs coaches hired to be head coaches without having been coordinators first. But Charles had been another guy who'd sort of been in that, he'd been interviewing, he'd kind of been in those circles, and then this opportunity emerged at Marshall. But that to me is more the exception than sort of the norm when it comes to black head coaching candidates.
Yeah, that's true. Huff is maybe the model that needs to be seen more often, in not just in for the minority coaches, right? He's closer to the Jed Fish model. In that, again, well, Jed Fish was a coordinator, but again, in so far as not that the sterling, that obvious resume of previous head coaching experience or coordinator experience, because those are the things that generally trigger like, okay, you're next in line. So the fact that Huff was able to get a job from being running backs coach, but being still around very successful programs, and maybe the secret sauce on Charles ultimately was, he was at Alabama, and Alabama is a launching pad place, and not everybody can coach at Alabama. But being around Nick Saban has been a very good thing for aspiring head coaches. Which leads me to this: I haven't had a chance to talk too much about the Sark hire. I've talked sort of around it a little bit because of when it happened. But let me just get into that a little bit with you before we change topics here. And that, listen, Sark was a guy who had some success as a head coach, but of course his personal problems with alcohol, undercut everything, right? Who knows what kind of career he might have had at USC if not for his personal issues. So you can sort of take his time at Washington, where he did some rebuilding. That Washington program was really, really in the hole when he got there, and he got it to a level where it was competing, maybe not on a really high level like Chris Peterson has had it, but got it competing again at a much better level than it was before. And then he got the USC job, and it all came apart there with his personal life. He gets his next opportunity at Alabama. And I think that the thought is that his success at Alabama can be transferred to Texas. But I got to tell you, I'm always a little skeptical of that because he's not at Alabama. I don't know if Alabama's success is transferable.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's something that we'll find out. I mean, there's no direct answer, but I get why Texas hired Sark this time around. I think it was very clear what Texas needed and what they weren't getting from Herman, and whether Sark can deliver that or not, we'll see. But he did deliver it at Alabama, and throughout his career has been known as an elite play caller and a guy who can develop great quarterbacks. Because it's very clear to me in watching Texas, who I thought made strides defensively at times this year, and again was right there with Oklahoma, right there with Iowa State. They are not potent enough on offense, and they aren't elite enough at quarterback. And that is obviously there's more to the job, especially a job as complex as Texas, and its complexity has probably hurt its record and its performance, maybe as much or more so than any program in the country, just how many things you have to deal with in that program. But if you really boil it down, Ralph, Sark is there to develop an elite quarterback and to score a ton of points. Because if not, they're going to keep losing to Oklahoma or, I guess, Iowa State. And they're not going to be a true national contender, because it's very clear from what we've seen in the last few years, you need an offense like the one Sark had at Alabama to win a national championship, or the one that LSU had with Joe Burrow and Joe Brady a year ago, or the types of offenses that Clemson has had under Dabo Swinney, or that Ohio State is creating with Ryan Day. If you don't have that, you can't achieve at a national level, and that's what Texas aspires to be. And when your top competitor in the league is Oklahoma and Lincoln Riley, and I guess now you throw in Matt Campbell, at least for last year and this year, and they have the potential to be truly elite on offense, and you don't, that's why you have to make the change. I mean, Sam Ehlinger had a great career there, and I really hope that he goes down and is remembered as a really important person in the history of Texas football. But let's face it, they never got to that truly next level on offense with him there. I don't think it was all his fault, but it just didn't happen. That's what Sark is there for. That's why Chris Del Conte went out and made this bold move to bring him in, even though there's a lot of money obviously left on Tom Herman's contract.
There was an interesting thing I feel like might be, I don't know if I would call it necessarily a trend, but you definitely spotted at Alabama, and I think we spotted it at Ohio State. And I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago on this podcast, is when I had talked to Chip Kelly about Ryan Day, he had said the main thing. Chip even said Chip was talking when he went to the NFL, and the idea that the biggest difference between NFL offense and college offense, from his standpoint, as far as sort of running the offense, is that in the NFL you have to be a different offense every week. Matchups dictate the way you can play, and not so much as I'm going to be this, and this is how I'm going to win. And even though Alabama always has a massive talent advantage, so essentially Alabama could conceivably do whatever it wants, but Alabama's offense was an offense that sort of had the ability to morph every week, and I think that's what Sark probably brought. Sark was always a pretty good offensive mind, but I also wonder if that's something that Sark brought with him from the NFL and his time with the Falcons, this understanding that the offense has to morph. The offense has to be a little different. You can't just be one thing every week. Now, of course, again, with Alabama, you can be anything at Alabama because you have all the best players. So you could literally morph into the best of any version of offense you want. And I think that it's probably one of the reasons why Saban brought in Bill O'Brien. But I do think that when Del Conte looks at Alabama's offense and looks at Sark, I do wonder if that's what he sees. And not just, hey, I have to be explosive offensively, I have to develop quarterbacks, but this is the way to do it. This pro-style approach, and this guy's got that ability. So it's not just about running my organization. You're right. It definitely is about getting that, because that's how you build elite teams in college football.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and I think to your point, you mentioned the way things ended for Sark at USC, and it wasn't good. But I think you give him credit for obviously seemingly improving his personal life, but also developing professionally. Going to Alabama the first time, and then to the Falcons, and then back to Alabama, and then winning with different types of quarterbacks, and evolving the scheme. And it's going to be a challenge now, because he's not going to have that offensive line that he had at Alabama. Now he does have the offensive line coach, because he brought Kyle Flood with him to Texas, which I thought was very smart. And now that's will be the third stop in a row that they've been together, because they were with each other with the Falcons as well. But they're not going to have the offensive line that Alabama had. They're not going to have the receivers necessarily that Alabama had, or maybe the quarterback, although I think Texas has recruited really well at that position. So it's going to be interesting to see how they and Sark especially as the primary play caller, how they evolve and hit on the strengths of what they inherit, and then augment that through recruiting to ideally get to a point where you're closer to resembling what you had with Alabama this year. But it's certainly not going to happen right away at Texas.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Come back and change the subject a little bit with Adam Rittenberg from ESPN joining us, a recurring guest and my friend. Take a quick break on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast and come back right after this.
Hey all podcast consumers, Rich Eisen here. So often aspiration comes from inspiration, with titans of industry being those torchbearers. With guests from the world of news, business, sports, and entertainment, my new show is going to give you their most in-depth first-hand stories that focuses on the humble beginnings and humbling moments that we can relate to in our own lives. The podcast is called Just Getting Started with me, Rich Eisen. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Adam Rittenberg from ESPN, great national writer, does a fantastic job of covering the sport from all angles. So, Adam, we talked a lot about coaches. You know, the other thing that has now become, February is now transfer month to a certain degree in college football, and there'll be more as the spring plays out because you'll have another, probably have another wave after spring practice, and it looks like we're actually going to have like relatively normal spring practice. In fact, did you know Coastal Carolina is already halfway? I believe they are halfway through spring practice.
They're just not stopping. Just going right from the bowl game pretty much to spring ball down in Conway, South Carolina.
You know, Jamie Chadwell and I spoke about this, and he said, he's like, we're at the beach, and my kids, they chose this school to a certain degree to be at the beach. And so if I have spring practice later, I know they are going to be distracted by wanting to go to the beach. Like, it's South Carolina, it's the beach, but, the weather in February is still a little, it can be a little cool. It's not exactly beach weather. So his idea is, I want to get this out of the way so I have their full attention, and then those kids can go, do the things that they came to Coastal Carolina to do, which is go hang out at the beach. But it's a good sign that we're going to have a normal spring practice, and after spring practice there'll be another wave of transfers. And I might be putting you on the spot here a little bit, but like, are any of the transfers that have sort of jumped out at you as like, hey, I'm pretty interested to see how this guy or that guy works out next season?
Yeah, it's an interesting year.
There's a ton of them, so it's hard to whittle it down to a certain degree.
Right, and you don't have, at least yet, 5 or 6 huge name quarterback guys that have transferred. That's been such a big part of the sport the last few years. Now there's some. Mackenzie Milton, for other reasons, is so interesting. Can he play for Florida State? How is he going to look out there if he gets a chance to really contribute? It would be an awesome story if he does, just with all that he's been through after that devastating injury at UCF. Charlie Brewer from Baylor, who led them to a Big 12 championship game appearance and a Sugar Bowl a couple of years ago. He's now at Utah. Utah's kind of had this run on Power 5 transfers after Jake Bentley came, and now he's off to South Alabama. Ryan Helinski's at Northwestern. I think that could be big because they're trying to fill the shoes of another transfer in Peyton Ramsey. And then at other positions, I think it's even more interesting. Eric Gilbert is a big deal going from LSU to Florida, especially after what we saw Kyle Pitts do at tight end for Florida. Can Eric Gilbert, who is the top tight end recruit in the country in the 2020 class, can he contribute in a big way for Florida this year? I think Eric Gray going from Tennessee to Oklahoma at running back is interesting. That run game was good, but not. We've seen better at Oklahoma at times from the running back spot. I think Gray is a guy that could step in and be a real contributor there. One name that I'm really excited to see, Ralph, is Wandel Robinson going from Nebraska to Kentucky. I talked to Wandel right after he announced his decision, and there's kind of 2 reasons. He wants to be closer to his mom, who's had some health issues, and they're from Frankfort, Kentucky, and then also to play in a different offense under Liam Cohen, who's coming in from the NFL, who I've known about for a number of years, young play caller, who I think will be a really good addition at Kentucky. And they've actually added several transfers. So is Penn State. Keontae Ingram, we were just talking about Texas, the running back there going to USC to maybe spark that run game. So we could just go on and on here, but there's not as many quarterbacks, but overall there's just a huge number of transfers that could be impact players in 2021.
Right, and we don't have clarity yet on whether everybody will be immediately eligible. Now, I think it's probably fairly safe to assume that rule was going to get voted in. That legislation was supposed to get passed in February. It got coupled with the NIL legislation, not through the NCAA, but through the Department of Justice. When the DOJ came in and said, hey, we want to talk to you about your NIL rules, they may be breaking antitrust laws. They also threw the transfer rule in there. From talking to a few people, there's a chance that might get that the NIL still has some hurdles, and there's going to be some complications. The transfer rule, I think, should be decoupled again. I'll use that again, and end up being on its. I think by April that should be sorted out. The one-time exception will be in place, and everybody you see in the portal will be able to play next year. The problem, if it's not, quite frankly, they're probably just going to have to hand out a bunch of waivers. And I'm sure nobody wants to do that.
No.
So my sense of this is that will work itself out, even though we're in limbo now. And everybody you see in the portal, all this talk we're talking about of who's going where, and it becomes kind of a fun, not fun for coaches to a certain degree, but certainly fun for fans who like transactions. This becomes the free agency of college football. But I do think this is the new normal. And it will be interesting to see how it sorts out this year and what teams feel like, I got burned there, too many transfers, like we can't do that anymore, and what teams, maybe are diving into the transfer market more than they would have normally and think, hey, maybe we found something here. The volatility of this will be interesting going forward.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm with you. I think we're going to see anyone that transferred this year be eligible for the 21 season. I'm sort of assuming that at this point. There's a number of guys who haven't made those decisions yet. But I think it'll be fascinating. I mean, I've talked to coaches who feel like you almost need to devote a department or at least staff members strictly to the portal.
Yep.
And then others are much more selective and feel like, we really need this person to be a fit, and we're not going to just go scouring for anybody who's available, who used to be a great recruit or had great numbers at the group of 5 level. It's not like we're just going to take anybody. So I think it'll be very interesting to see the different approaches. But I think one thing that I've noticed is programs that historically did not have a lot of transfers are just having transfers because that's where we're at. Like, you have to assume, because this is out there and it's part of the sport, that you're going to have a number of transfers every single year. And you have to be prepared for that.
Penn State seems to be a good example of that. They brought in quite a few, and they've lost a bunch over the last. Really, since the portal came open, there was a lot more movement there. But Franklin wasn't necessarily a guy who has been bringing in a ton of transfers. But if you're losing them, you have to replace these bodies from somewhere, and it becomes hard to do it through just signing high school kids. Right, and that's and then there's obviously the discussion about increasing the counters or doing something different with the number of scholarships if you do have players that go into the portal, and then you're dealing with lower numbers at a certain position. How can you fill those over maybe a 2-year span instead of being strictly having to adhere to 25 scholarships per year? So that's another part of it. But Penn State's an example. Florida State has had a lot of players transfer in. Texas Tech seems to be very active. Really the last few years in terms of bringing transfers into the program there. I know Ole Miss just got a fairly big time transfer on defense from Maryland. Northwestern, I mentioned them earlier. They haven't been a program historically that's lost a lot of players, but they had several key guys that transferred after even a great season, and so they're having to fill a little bit now with obviously Helinski and a couple of other guys, but they're going to be more selective, I think, than most programs. So it just depends on the program. It probably is somewhat reflective of how you recruit. And we always talk about who offers 1 million scholarships and who is more selective with the scholarships. It's probably similar with how you approach the transfer portal. But I think you're naive if you think you can just get through year after year without losing some of your players to the portal, even if you feel like you're doing everything right by them. And the other interesting part of trying to assess what next season looks like, and listen, at the very top of the sport, it's probably going to look a lot similar to the way it has looked over the last few years, because teams like Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Ohio State are recruiting at a level. Oklahoma maybe a rung below that, but still recruiting at a level that that is a lot better than even their conference competitions. But when you start looking toward like more the middle class of the sport, one of the things to keep an eye on, and I've mentioned it on this podcast a couple of times, is the super seniors that are going to be coming back, bringing back kids who had got an extra year of eligibility through the pandemic year. Who and a lot of times these are going to be players who weren't necessarily or don't necessarily have like very clear NFL futures, but could still be very good college players and now be 22 or 23 years old and sort of be grown men. And you mentioned Texas Tech is doing a lot of work in the transfer portal. They're also a team that has stood out to me as I do a little research on getting, a bunch of super seniors back that might end up being key contributors. I'm looking at their list and I'm seeing I think it's like about 7 guys who are starters who are going to be back next year who otherwise would have been out of eligibility. And I'm interested to see how that plays out over the landscape of college football. And if there are teams that, suddenly have, again, like 6 or 7, sixth-year seniors that propel them to a better year than they thought. Maybe this is how Brett Bielema turns around Illinois. Apparently they're going to have about 20 of these guys back. So I don't know if any particular team has stood out to you, but I'm wondering as you talk to coaches, like how do they think this impacts the next season?
No, it's a huge part of, or it's definitely a part of the stories going into next year. And I think you mentioned a couple of programs there, Texas Tech, Illinois. I think I'd throw Wisconsin into that mix as a team that also is bringing back quite a few players who could have gone or just exhausted their eligibility, or I guess tried to move on to the NFL. But I think there's a genre. It's the developmental programs, and if there's ever a year where the developmental programs maybe can catch up a little bit from a depth standpoint and experience standpoint, it's a year like this when they can keep their seniors who maybe didn't arrive ready to play at this level, or at least play a lot, and have developed into really solid college players. Now they're back for another year. So maybe that makes the 2021 season a little bit more interesting when Ohio State, the Ohio States and the Alabamas and the Clemsons are all they're all losing their normal supplement of third-year players who are just that good, who aren't going to have no real reason to stick around for even a fourth year, much less a sixth year. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. And whether some of these again non-blue bloods, more developmental type programs can really take a step. And for Texas Tech, maybe that's just getting to 7 or 8 wins, or for Kansas State, maybe that's taking another step forward. Maybe for Wisconsin, it's getting back to the Big Ten championship game. They haven't gone 2 years without making the Big Ten championship game since the game started in 2011. So that's a team that I'm watching. Maybe there's somebody in the Pac-12 that has quite a few of those players back that can make a step forward. I mean, Iowa State to me, Ralph, is fascinating because if there was ever a team that again, was close this past year, made the Big 12 championship game, won the Fiesta Bowl, but they bring back pretty much everybody. And so, can Iowa State make the playoff? Like that might be a conversation that we're having. That maybe not necessarily with all these super seniors, but they had a lot of guys that at least were NFL draft eligible that are coming back from a team that was really good and finished in the top 10. So I'm excited to see if they'll. I think we're all kind of pining for more variety in the sport, and maybe because of this weird rule because of the pandemic and who it's affecting, we're going to get that in 2021.
Yeah, the other thing it will help these developmental programs do is develop, right? If you're Wisconsin and you have a few guys coming back, or again, pick any of the programs we just mentioned, I think West Virginia might be in good position as far as some of these super seniors as well. If you have 6 players who are sixth-year seniors who you are going to be able to keep in your 2 deep, then that's more likely for you to be able to redshirt that freshman or ease in the freshman or ease in the sophomore and get that kid a little more developed as opposed to relying on them to actually play and take key reps. So you're right. I don't know if it upsets the balance, though Iowa State is a very interesting one. I think Iowa State's the only unfortunate thing for Iowa State is it's timing up this, maybe best ever team when Oklahoma is really good again.
Yeah.
Like Oklahoma seemed like Oklahoma took a little bit of a step back the last couple of years. And just when I say step back, a little bit of a step back the last couple of years. And I think was primed to be caught. And they didn't get caught. They ended up winning the Big 12 anyway. And now they come back with the experienced quarterback and with some, a defense that may be the best that they've had in a few years. So unfortunately for Iowa State, it's going to make for a very fascinating and very competitive race in the Big 12. But unfortunately for Iowa State, they're catching Oklahoma on an upswing as opposed to a little bit of a downswing.
Yeah, no, right. No, and no doubt. I mean, the one thing, though, with them, which I've just loved, I mean, there was a great stat earlier today put out by Mike Green, who's the great sports information director at Iowa State, about Matt Campbell and just showing that they've won 12 games as a ranked team in the past 4 years after winning 13 in the previous – God, my math is bad, as you know, Ralph. But 120.
Yeah, it's about 100.
Years.
Yeah, it's 100 plus years. Yeah.
So they're not going to go into Norman, Oklahoma, and be intimidated. I'll just put it that way. But you're absolutely right. OU is going to be really good, and I've been as critical as anybody of the fact that they can't get over the hump in the playoff, and it's mainly because their defense just hasn't been talented enough. But I think that if they ever have a team that can actually win a playoff game and maybe make a run at a national title, it could be a team like this, which is growing and developing on that side of the ball, in addition to having some really talented players, as always, on the offensive side.
Last thing, and then I'll let you roll, Adam, is right before we started taping on Tuesday afternoon, early around lunchtime, Notre Dame in Florida announced that they have a home-and-home set up. It's 10 years out, 2031, 2032. Who knows? Maybe we'll still be in these gigs, Adam, by then, God willing. But it's part of a trend that we're seeing, and as far as the big schools ramping up their schedules. In fact, that 2031 season, I think it is, Florida's non-conference opponents for that season, and I'm sure this will change, or I suspect this will change, are Texas, Notre Dame, Arizona State, and Florida State. Now, my guess is they'll do some rearranging there because they might not want all of those teams on the schedule at once. But it's a continuation of a trend, and one that maybe signals that we'll have a different playoff by then.
No doubt. I think everybody's planning for the 8-teamer and beefing up the schedules. The thing that I love about this, Ralph, and you'll appreciate it as somebody who lives in a colder climate like I do. You're in New York, I'm in Chicago. I cannot wait, even if I'm not working in the business, I will have to be at that middle of November game at Notre Dame Stadium when Florida comes in. I just want to see an SEC team in a cold weather environment in November. And I commend Florida for not just scheduling the game, because they haven't been very willing to leave the state at all historically to play non-conference games, but actually to commit to a November game at Notre Dame. And you and I have covered some games in the snow there. I've covered some games that it's balmy. That USC game a few years ago, I think, was in November, and it was 60 degrees. So that's probably what we'll get. Florida will feel just at home. But I really want it to be 5 degrees. And freezing, and just seeing all the Florida players have to leave Gainesville for South Bend in the middle of November and actually experience the weather game, because those of us who have covered the Big Ten and some of the other cold weather schools or leagues, it's such a different game, such a different experience that those in the mighty SEC don't typically see. So I'm certainly rooting for that if that game rolls around in 2031.
Adam Rittenberg is the national college football writer for ESPN, and he does a tremendous job of covering the sport from all different angles. Adam, thanks so much for joining me. Enjoy what I hope will be a more normal offseason for all of us, and thanks so much again for coming on the show today.
You bet, Ralph. Really enjoy it, and be safe out there. Thanks for having me on.
And now 3 and out. First down. As Adam and I mentioned during our discussion, Iowa State announced a contract extension for Matt Campbell earlier this week. The new deal is for 8 years and runs through the 2028 season. No financial terms were released, but Campbell was scheduled to make $3.7 million in 2020 before taking a pandemic pay cut of about $500,000. Fair to assume that Campbell is now a $4 million a year coach at least. I have never hidden my belief that Campbell is a difference-making coach, and as every season passes at Iowa State, my belief is confirmed. The Cyclones had their best ever finish in the AP poll last season at number 9, and he has far exceeded the traditional performance of that program. Campbell's loyalty to Iowa State has made it clear that he won't be leaving Ames for just any job, but if you had to ask me to lay odds, I'd say the chances are better than 50% that 2021 will be Campbell's last season at Iowa State. And the better things go for the Cyclones next year, the less likely he will be with the program in 2022. I believe either an NFL job or one of the premier college jobs will finally pry him away. Second down, Washington State got some bad offseason news, suspending quarterback Jayden de Laura after he was charged with DUI earlier this week. De Laura started all 4 games for the Cougars last season as a freshman and played basically like a freshman with some promise. Good at times, bad at other times. Second-year coach Nick Rolovich brought in former Tennessee quarterback Jared Garantano as a grad transfer to provide some competition at that position this season. It's impossible to know what the DUI means in the long run to de Laura, but I think it's safe to say this was probably not helping his chances to hold on to that starting job. Garantano will be an interesting player to watch next season. On one hand, he never lived up to his blue-chip hype at Tennessee. On the other hand, he was really never put in a great position to succeed with different offensive coordinators and head coaches throughout his time there. Maybe Rolo's run-and-shoot unlocks Garantano's potential. Third down will be a note about this podcast. For a long time, I have thought about trying to get the listeners more involved in the show with something of a mailbag segment or episodes. Now I'm finally going to do it. If you have questions that you'd like me or my guests to answer, email them to AP Top 25 Mailbag. AP Top 25 Mailbag. That's 25, not spelled out, but the digits 25. AP Top 25 Mailbag at gmail.com. I'll include the address in the show notes and drop a reminder to send your questions during the intros and conclusions of the shows going forward. We'd love to hear from you on all topics college football, serious or silly. That's AP Top 25 Mailbag at gmail.com. Looking forward to your contributions. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcasts, just about anywhere you'd like to get your podcast. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.